the story kind of combines some long-standing interests of mine. One which is this business of a lost civilization that, as geology and archaeology progress, we're finding a lot of basis in fact for a lot of the story of Atlantis, especially, and in later years the story of Noah, have been seen as in modern times as purely mythology and purely fanciful. But as we continue to have archaeological discoveries and continue to learn more about geology and about the state of the world thousands of years ago, these things are actually starting to line up, and there's a picture of our remote past that's actually coming together for us. And especially there was a period at 12,000 years ago, which was the height of what's called the LGM, the last glacial maximum, at which geologists know that something traumatic happened in the Earth, and sea levels rose dramatically, as much as 100 meters. And as archaeologists and scuba divers, both professional and amateur, continue to circle the world and look for evidence underwater, they're finding more and more structures, monolithic structures, even cyclopean structures built of huge stones that are at depths of 70 and 100 meters underwater. And geologists know for a fact that the last time these civilizations, these structures, were above water was at about 11 to 12,000 years ago. So we know for a fact now that there were fairly advanced civilizations that lived at that time, and that something happened, global warming and glacial melting, or even catastrophic things that would have led to that made the sea level rise and flood low-lying areas. And as far as Atlantis goes, there are a lot of course, a lot of theories about where Atlantis is. For a long time, people assumed that because its name was Atlantis, that it would have been in the Atlantic Ocean, and that's where Plato described Atlantis in the work that the first work that really describes Atlantis in detail. He describes it as as just outside the Straits of Gibraltar. And since then, in later years, Atlantis is a whole cottage industry, and there have been hundreds of books speculating about where it might be and when it might have been. And it's interesting that the time frame that Plato gave for Atlantis was, I think, about 9,000 years before his own lifetime, which would have put it at close to something like 11,600 years before our own lifetime. So the time frame that he gave for this cataclysm that wiped out this legendary civilization is actually lined up exactly with what geologists know of when sea levels rose. So that part is interesting. But my favorite in theories about where Atlantis is have ranged from, of course, the Atlantic Ocean, but we know the Atlantic Ocean has been mapped completely. The floor has been completely mapped, and archaeologists and oceanographers are fairly certain that there's nothing down there that's suspicious. Other theories have been that the Antarctica is actually the home of Atlantis, and now it's buried under 3 to 5 miles of ice, and so of course we wouldn't be able to detect any civilization at that point. And that theory is tied up with the pole shift theory, that the Earth's poles actually were in a different position during former ages, and so the continent of Antarctica was in a temperate zone, whereas other places in the Earth were at the poles and therefore under ice, and something cataclysmic happened to shift the orientation of the Earth. The ice caps at the poles got too massive and then shifted. There are other theories that Atlantis is not underwater at all, but is actually under the Sahara Desert, and that's why we can't find it's buried under sand because of other changes in the Earth. But my personal favorite theory at this point is that The true site of this kingdom that we reference in the movie is basically in Indonesia, or in Southeast Asia, and that's why we have sort of set up the geography of the movie to move from mountainous arid regions down to forest, down to desert, and down to the coast in a tropical setting. And the reason that this is an attractive theory is because the South China Sea is a vast plain. The land basically between China and Indonesia is at a depth of about 100 meters or less in places. And so one can imagine that this was at one time a part of a vast continent. It would have been part of Asia, but would have been above water at that time. And we know from genetic testing that humans have been in that area for a very long time, upwards of 50,000 years. Humans have been in Australia, so we know that humans have been in that, and so it makes sense that this would be one of the oldest spots on Earth. The oldest civilization on Earth is in India, and so being very close by, you can imagine that a civilization just moved right next door from Indonesia or Indochina into India, and at that point, took on. So we tried to work with the costuming and then the face paint of the elders to have some references to sort of traditional Indian garb, because we know that to be truly the oldest surviving civilization in the world. So we've tried to play with that idea as well. And also you can just look at our recent history of Indonesia, the geological history. I mean, there's no more geologically unstable place on Earth. We have the Krakatoa volcano of 1883, which had effects all around the world, from changes in sea level to the sunsets for months afterwards. It was a truly cataclysmic event. In more recent history, we've had the tsunami of December 26, 2004, which is in that same subduction zone as Krakatoa, and you saw the horrific flooding that took place from that. And it was shortly after that tsunami that Jay and I started talking about floods and talking about as a lot of people did at the time, the spiritual ramifications of natural disasters, where whole swaths of humanity are wiped out. And how does that fit in with our notion of God and a loving God and who God was? So out of some of those conversations came the spiritual aspects of that story. But the last thing we know about the Sumatra, Indonesia region is that we think now that there was a massive Krakatoa style, but on orders of magnitude higher, explosion at about 70,000 BC. And that volcano, that explosion, destruction of a volcano, caused a nuclear winter that then took the population of modern humans in Africa down to a level of about 2,000 individuals. And that's from that time forward, there was a selection process that took place that caused the Great Leap Forward and the exodus out of Africa.